Okay, this is going to be a very fun video to make. It's going to be very similar to the running back video that we did, where we are going to be talking about wide receivers that are almost being drafted at their floor, but they have hidden upside. If another injury were to occur in the wide receiver room, then all of a sudden you could see that their ceiling is a lot higher than where they're being drafted. A perfect example of this would be someone like Tyler Boyd, who last year finished as the wide receiver 40, and on Underdog Fantasy right now, Tyler Boyd's being drafted as the wide receiver 53. So we'll hop into a couple of these exciting options, but before we get into it, please make sure you go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. I think that should be it. Let's go through and let's dive into our first wide receiver. This one is an easy guy to bring up, and honestly, he may have that ceiling at the beginning of the season as well. Let's go over to Russell Gage. So with Russell Gage, no, he has never been elite. No, Russell Gage has never been a league-winning wide receiver, but just because he wasn't in Atlanta doesn't mean he can't be that in Tampa. Because if we go through and if we look at this situation, as of today, when I'm recording this, maybe that has changed, but Rob Gronkowski has not signed with this team. And Chris Godwin, while I love taking him in fantasy drafts, we can admit he's going to miss the beginning portion of the season. With Chris Godwin, he tore his ACL on December 19th. If we just do some real quick napkin math here, we can say, okay, well, if that's a 9-month timetable, which is almost best case scenario with the torn ACL, that means Chris Godwin's what? Coming back around September 19th? That's about week 3. Best case scenario. Chris Godwin's an older wide receiver as well. Maybe we can assume that Chris Godwin misses some more time than that. Chris Godwin gets back weeks 5, 6. I don't want that to happen. Trust me, I have so much Chris Godwin. I really hope it doesn't happen. But if that were to occur, Russell Gage all of a sudden is a top 2 option in an offense that could potentially have no Gronk, potentially have no Chris Godwin, and Antonio Brown is gone. Antonio Brown leaving is a massive deal in that if you go through and if you look over the past 3 seasons and yards per route run, I know we don't want to believe it. I know we don't want to act like it, but Antonio Brown, the last time he was on the football field, whether that's 2021, 2020, every time we have seen him, he has been an elite level wide receiver. Now, yes, you probably don't want him in your locker room. I get it, but the play on the field itself was elite from Antonio Brown. Antonio Brown leaving is going to open up a massive hole here for Russell Gage, who has gotten better every single season over the past 3. I mean, if we go back to 2019, Russell Gage, wide receiver 90 in fantasy football, bumps that up to wide receiver 56 in 2020, bumps that up to wide receiver 44 in 2021. So just continuously every single season getting better. I mean, you see this regardless of the statistic that you're looking at. You know, one of my favorite stats we can find on RotoViz is going to be yards per route run, where Russell Gage 1.2 yards per route run in 2019. That's horrible. That is straight up garbage. Like, unbelievably bad. In 2020, he bumps that up to 1.6. Not great, but at least he looks like an NFL wide receiver. And then this past season, he bumps that up to 2 yards per route run. Now, of course, this isn't just because Russell Gage is getting better. Now, he's probably developing as a wide receiver, but this was also due to the fact that back in 2019, back in 2020, he had probably the toughest competition for targets you were ever going to see. He had to go up against Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley. I mean, if you're going up against Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley, realistically, what are you supposed to do? And if we look at the splits from 2019 to 2021 for Russell Gage with and without Julio Jones, with and without Calvin Ridley, dear God, it's a night and day difference. The first stat that we are going to be looking at is with and without Julio Jones, where with Julio Jones, Russell Gage has averaged about 5.8 targets per game. He's averaged about 8.3 fantasy points per game, whereas with no Julio Jones in this offense, instead of 8.3 points per game, that goes up to nearly 13. Instead of 5.8 targets per game, that goes up to 7. So you see that massive step up, and we see the same thing with no Calvin Ridley. Now, it's not a 50-50 split in terms of games played with and without Calvin Ridley. It's a lot more in terms of leaning with games played with Calvin Ridley, but still, you have 40 receiving yards per game in games that Calvin Ridley plays compared to almost 60 receiving yards per game in games that Calvin Ridley misses. We can see the same thing. Targets. He averages 2 more targets per game with no Calvin Ridley in his offense. So we can see that Russell Gage maybe always had the talent, and the issue was he was being blocked by elite level wide receivers in his offense, but now he will have the role in Tampa, who should be a top 3 passing offense in terms of pass rate over expectation, especially in game neutral environments. And what is most telling about Russell Gage right now is the fact that if you head over and if you look at his contract, the contract the Tampa Bay Buccaneers paid him, the man got paid $20 million guaranteed. The man got paid $30 million total. Now, guaranteed money means more. And if we compare this to someone who's going in the 5th round of fantasy drafts right now, in Juju Smith-Schuster, Juju got paid $2.4 million, like $2.49 million by the Kansas City Chiefs. Just for reference, that is ridiculous. And we're looking at Underdog Fantasy, where right now you currently have Russell Gage being drafted as the wide receiver 43. Remember, we saw that he finished as the wide receiver 44 last year. So it's almost like, you know what? Russell Gage is being drafted at his floor. But if Chris Godwin misses more time than expected, if Rob Gronkowski potentially doesn't come back, if an injury were to occur to Mike Evans, who's to say he doesn't have elite upside in a Tom Brady-led offense that would be top 3 in the NFL in passing yards and passing touchdowns? Now, if you want to get into real money fantasy football drafts today, draft some Russell Gage. Make sure you go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. I know y'all have seen us have over 100 live streams about Underdog already this offseason. I'm addicted. I've already done 150 real money fantasy football drafts. You can join the fun. You can draft with us on the live stream, draft with random people in the public lobby, draft with your friends. Have a ton of fun. Use promo code FLOCK when you sign up, and they'll match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to 100. You'll get my rankings. You'll get my Dynasty rankings, Dynasty Rookie ranks, Dynasty Rookie draft guide. Most importantly, you'll have some fun. You'll support this channel. And yeah, you can find the link in the description. And let's go to our next guy. Someone that I made a video and got so much hate on it over there on the Dynasty channel. The second Davante Adams was traded over, Hunter Renfrow. Now with Hunter Renfrow, yes. Thomas, please throw up keep trade cut. And look at the time period where we said Hunter Renfrow was one of the most overvalued players in Dynasty fantasy football. We never really talked about him from a redraft perspective. His values come down a crap ton, okay? His value is in a completely different range than where it was before. Right now, Hunter Renfrow is being drafted as the wide receiver 40 on Underdog Fantasy. Now, if you look at where he finished this past season, he finished as the wide receiver 20 on a per game basis. Now, of course, you're not expecting Hunter Renfrow to finish the wide receiver 20 just because he did it in year 3. I mean, nobody is expecting that. And if you're expecting that, you have lost your mind. But there's an interesting situation happening with a couple of these offenses, including the Las Vegas Raiders, and that here with Hunter Renfrow, this is a team that is going to have an extremely concentrated target share. They're going to get the ball to Josh Jacobs in the running game, Davante Adams, Darren Waller, and Renfrow. Those are the only players touching the ball here in Las Vegas. You're not going to have to deal with the Cedric Wilsons of the world in Dallas going through and playing a rotation as your wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, and vulturing away so many of the touches, so many of the fantasy points from those top options. That's not going to be the case in Las Vegas because the guys you have behind those top level options, Keelan Cole, Mac Hollins, Dylan Stoner, TJ Turner, Justin Hall. What is that depth chart? They have absolutely nothing. And last season, when at times, dear God, Zay Jones was the wide receiver 2 in Las Vegas because you had Henry Ruggs in prison, because Bryan Edwards was horrible, because Darren Waller missed 6 weeks. Derek Carr still managed to post a top 5 season in terms of passing yards overall last year. So if Derek Carr is posting a top 5 season in passing yards with nobody around him, we can assume that it's a very safe projection to have the Las Vegas Raiders yet again top 5 in the NFL in terms of overall passing volume. Now, I will admit, if Davante Adams stays healthy, if Darren Waller stays healthy, Hunter Renfrow is not finishing higher than wide receiver 40. He's being drafted where he should be if you have both Darren Waller and Davante Adams healthy. I mean, the reason I was saying that Hunter Renfrow was overvalued at the beginning of the offseason when he was going way earlier than this, when he was almost a top 24 wide receiver, is if you look at the splits with Darren Waller playing versus not, I mean, you actually had Hunter Renfrow averaging 8.33 targets per game with no Darren Waller in this offense. He was averaging 66 receiving yards per game compared to 55 with Darren Waller in this offense. This is provided by Rotoviz. So clearly, one of the reasons that Hunter Renfrow was posting wide receiver 1 weeks at the end of the year was because Darren Waller was not there. And with Davante Adams coming over, Davante Adams will have a 25% team target share. Davante Adams will be a black hole in this offense. But even with that happening, because the concentration of targets, I'm fine saying Hunter Renfrow can be a wide receiver 4 in fantasy. And if something were to occur to Darren Waller or Davante Adams again, when we can project Derek Carr to be top 5 in the NFL in passing offense, I think this is another example of a player almost being drafted, I don't want to say near his floor, but he's being drafted at his median projection. And what you could find is if there was an injury, he has upside to be, I don't want to say a wide receiver 1. I don't want to say that, but definitely a top 24 option and possibly a high-end wide receiver 2 based on the passing volume here. So I think that's a fine bet if you're drafting him as your wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. Now let's move over to our next wide receiver. This is going to be Brandon Aiyuk. Now here with Aiyuk, this is an option that had a massive fall from where he was his rookie season. His rookie season, Brandon Aiyuk was incredibly impressive. I know we already talked about this, but if we pull up Brandon Aiyuk and see that he had damn near a 23% team target share at 22%, and he averaged 8 targets a game. And we filter out to see rookies that were able to do that their first year. You had Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Evans, Amari Cooper, Jalen Waddle. Now, you do have some busts. You have Kelvin Benjamin. You have Sammy Watkins. Sammy Watkins is great. Sammy Watkins is not a bust. You have Mike Williams, Justin Blackmon. But those are guys since 2010. I just want to put that in context. Say, hell, Brandon Aiyuk had a great year, a fantastic season. And with Aiyuk, one big thing is the probability Deebo Samuel and George Kittle get injured. Now, of course, you can't project both players to go down, but if one or the other were to miss time this upcoming season, which, Thomas, I know you've done this before, but please throw up the injury list for both of those players again. I mean, those are two guys that have it easily in their range of outcomes. I don't want to say to go down for the season, but even if they just go down 4 or 6 weeks, Brandon Aiyuk is then in an offense where no, Danny Gray is not going to draw targets. That's not going to happen. He will immediately be the wide receiver 1 if Deebo Samuel goes down. And honestly, if George Kittle goes down, it's almost better. If we go through and if we look at the splits of Brandon Aiyuk in games that George Kittle missed versus played with Aiyuk, here, Aiyuk averages 14 points per game with no George Kittle in this offense compared to 11.8 with George Kittle. That's mainly because he just draws so much volume. He averaged 8.33 targets per game with no George Kittle in this offense. And similarly, with no Deebo Samuel, you have 7 games played. And in those 7 games, Aiyuk averaged 14.7 points per game. He had 8 targets compared to 6.19 with Deebo Samuel. So if we pull this up and we see, okay, well, Brandon Aiyuk was the wide receiver 16 when he was a rookie. Yes, he had a down year. Yes, I agree with you. He probably shouldn't have been put in the doghouse at the beginning of the season, but it did happen. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 39. I would argue this is possibly below the median projection you should have, especially understanding the upside that would be there with the role in this 49ers offense if something were to occur to one of those very injury-prone pass catchers in George Kittle or Deebo Samuel. Now let's go over to our next wide receiver. This is going to be someone that I think is probably a value regardless of what happens with Justin Jefferson. It's going to be Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen right now is being drafted as the wide receiver 37. This is despite the wide receiver 8 finish in 2020. This is despite the wide receiver 18 finish in 2021. While Justin Jefferson was dominant. Justin Jefferson was out there just commanding 25% of this team's target share, which historically speaking, it's so hard to get above that. Now, even if we say, yeah, Jefferson's one of the best wide receivers to ever step foot on planet Earth, let's assume that he gets up to 28% of this team's target share. Hell, Adam Thielen is still going to have a very large role in this offense because the concentration for targets, very similar to what we were talking about with the Las Vegas Raiders. The Minnesota Vikings aren't a team that use a ton of wide receivers. I mean, I know if you look at KJ Osborne's statistics in 2021, it's going to be very misleading because you had Adam Thielen missing time. Remember, Adam Thielen went down. So the last time we can pull up a season where Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson played the majority of it was actually 2020 in Justin Jefferson's rookie year. And in that year, you had Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen combining for 233 targets. Whereas if you look at every other wide receiver on this roster, of course, tight ends draw targets, of course, running backs draw targets, of course, that's going to happen. But if we look at every other wide receiver, they had 49 targets. There are only 2 guys that get used here. And if you were to have an injury to Justin Jefferson, which I will say would be probably the worst thing ever. I don't know many injuries that would be more devastating if Justin Jefferson went down. We would expect the overall offensive efficiency to take a hit as well. But there, Adam Thielen, instead of averaging 20% of this team's target share, he himself could get up to 25, 26% based on the massive hole that would be available. And if you're telling me that we are drafting him as a high-end wide receiver 4 right now in fantasy, and he has a top 10 finish in 2020 and a mid-wide receiver 2 finish in 2021 with a healthy Justin Jefferson, I think that's an easy price to pay. Now, I will admit there are red flags with Adam Thielen. This is a wide receiver that's going into his age 32 season. Okay, so naturally, you are going to need a discount if you're going to draft a 32-year-old wide receiver. And on top of this, there is a risk that all of a sudden the red zone usage goes down for Adam Thielen, because the reason he has been elite in fantasy is over the past 3 years, he has averaged almost a 12% touchdown rate in Minnesota. Unless you are Adam Thielen, unless you are Mike Evans, that is not sustainable. That touchdown rate is going to come down. So a potential worry that you could have with Thielen and why he is not going to be the wide receiver 18 again this upcoming year, unless Jefferson were to go down, is if Justin Jefferson himself all of a sudden just increases his role in the red zone. Because if we look at the distribution for the touchdown rates here, Justin Jefferson's touchdown rate in 2021 was 5.99%. In 2020, it was 5.6%. That was half of what you had from Adam Thielen. Are we sure that Adam Thielen is that much better in the red zone? Are we sure that going into year 3 that Justin Jefferson all of a sudden doesn't take the next leap and he adds that part of his game? It's a possibility. That's one of the reasons Adam Thielen is going so much lower in drafts right now than where he's been going historically. But I think it is an offense that concentrates their targets, which I want to be targeting. And then our last wide receiver is the perfect example of an offense that will refuse to use anybody else but their starters. Tyler Boyd. God, I love me some Tyler Boyd. If you look at Boyd, almost the exact opposite of what we saw with Russell Gage. He has gotten worse every single season. Let's talk about the negatives before I get to the positives. If we look at his air yards per game in 2019, 91, 2020, 62. This past season, 45. His yards per route run also down. This is a player that his target share has gone down. His targets overall, they've all gone down just a straight line over the past 3 years. But hell, you had T. Higgins added into this offense in 2020. You had Jamar Chase added in 2021, both of whom were wide receiver 1s in fantasy last year. Both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins were top 12 options at the position. Now, I think they can continue to get better. Are you going to project Jamar Chase to be the wide receiver 1 in fantasy overall and T. Higgins also be a top 5 option this upcoming season? No, you can't do that. So I will say, I don't think that all of a sudden Higgins and Chase take that much more of this overall offense. Boyd was the wide receiver 40 last year on a per game basis. And right now he's being drafted as what? The wide receiver 53, the wide receiver 54. And there is that upside. We've seen it before. If Chase were to go down, if Higgins were to go down, we've seen a top 24 finish from Tyler Boyd. We've seen him average 9.3 targets per game. That was without Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow was not at quarterback in this offense. So that's where the upside's coming from. And going back to the concentration of targets, this is what gives Tyler Boyd a high floor. If we look at Chase, Higgins, and Boyd in the targets they drew last year, a combined 332 targets in this offense. And if we look at all other wide receivers, not including tight ends, not including running backs, of course, they're always going to be used, but all other wide receivers drew 27 targets in Cincinnati. Through 17 weeks, 27 targets. That means if you're not Tyler Boyd, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, you were averaging less than, combined, the rest of the wide receiver room is averaging less than 2 targets a week, and T. Higgins missed a couple games last year. I love the idea of looking at these offenses that concentrate their targets, concentrate their usage between just a few select players and going, okay, Tyler Boyd's probably being drafted at his floor. If we draft him here and Higgins, Chase, they stay healthy, it's not like we're making money. It's not like we're profiting. We made a very boring pick, and it is what it is. But if Higgins goes down, if Chase were to go down, how is Tyler Boyd not a top 24 wide receiver in this offense? Or at least the wide receiver 28 when he's being drafted as the wide receiver 53. I'm all about that life. But please let me know what y'all think. Please let me know if y'all are targeting these players in fantasy drafts right now. And if you have not done so already, please go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope you have a great day.